You might be in touch with Ellie Hegenbotham. I didn't see Ellie on the call yet, but Ellie for a very long time was chairing the local chapters committee. And she is full of information about it, about the possibilities there, as well as ideas that she has from having served on it. So again, if you're interested, please send me an email. I'll put you in touch with Ellie and we'll talk. So please consider applying. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So our speaker today is Adalberto Muller, and I apologize for butchering everything. It's just a horrible to not be able to do this well. But anyway, he's an assistant professor of literary theory and film studies at Universidade Federal Fluminense Niterói, Rio de Janeiro. He was a visiting scholar at Yale in 2013, a visiting professor at Université de Lyon in France, and a visiting scholar in Buffalo in 2018. He published a book called Orson Welles' Banda de un Homem Só in 2015, and Orson Welles, author of Don Quixote, which is a great title, in 2016. And he has recently translated the complete poems of Emily Dickinson in Portuguese. And the title of his talk is From South of the Border, Dickinson Latina. And I give you Adalberto.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Marianne Noble and Elizabeth Petrino for inviting me.
Look at this guy's shirt and his books.
To this Dickinson live series. I'm sorry, I was Marianne. I can no longer control the. I'm still a co-host, so I can.
Sorry, hang on one second.
If you want to make me co-host, Marianne, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. So,
but Adalberto, you are co-host.
Yeah. I'm just saying I cannot control.
Feel free to switch it to me. Marianne.
Oh, I see what you mean. Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
And thanks again, Marianne and Elizabeth Petrino, for inviting me to this Dickinson Live series, which is very exciting and very important for our society. And I want to say thank you and thanks to all members of Emily Dickinson Society who voted in the last election. I hope I can fulfill your expectations towards me. And again, I'm very happy to be with you in this moment. I hope you can appreciate very much this springtime. I think it's almost summertime, and you're probably hearing in the US the cicadas, which seems very, very beautiful after 17 years. And so I'm gonna share my screen in order to make it more comprehensible. And I hope that I'm not taking so much longer. I hope we will have time for debate. And if you need to make any remarks during my presentation, please feel free to send comments or to ask to raise your hand and to ask for a participation. So let's go. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. Let's go. From south of the border, Dickinson Latina. So I have to thank, first of all, to the editors of the forthcoming Emily Dickinson Oxford Handbook. It is a little bit because of them that I wrote this piece about, the piece is called actually Dickinson Latina Imaginary Geography. And I'm going to do a kind of summarize this essay that is about to come in this book. I'm not allowed to show it yet, but you can take a quick look at it, and then the book, the handbook is edited by Christina Müller and Karen Sanchez Apple. So The main issues in this article is should we talk only about how Emily Dickinson was translated in Latin America or Portuguese and Spanish speaking countries, or can we try to understand how Emily Dickinson herself was related to this, to Latin America, the Caribbean, or the countries, Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries. So it's a way of thinking that translation issues can be seen not only from outside of an author or the country of an author or the language of an author, but translation can be seen as a process inside the work. And this is, I believe, what happens in Emily Dickinson's work. So one of my first questions about Emily Dickinson was the presence of Brazil in this famous poem about Brazil. Brazil, I asked no other thing. This is the first line of the poem. It's the Franklin 687. It's a poem from the Fascicle 32. And then it follows like this: I offered being the mighty merchants near Brazil, but madam, is there nothing else that we can show you? Something like this. So this poem has been interpreted many times, even in Brazil, especially in Brazil, it's very well known. But and I went to the Houghton Library at the Harvard University because I wanted to understand how this poem fits inside the fascicle. This was my main issue. And this visit to this touching of the fascicle was very important for me, both for developing my translation theory, because I have my own translation theory in order to make this book, the first volume of Dickinson fascicles. This is my theory that I called stitching and suture, thinking exactly about the way that Emily Dickinson would stitch their fascicles. So my question at this moment is why Dickinson is talking about so many places in Latin America, and why she never mentions like Delaware or Tennessee or Connecticut or even Washington, or maybe South Hadley, which is the city nearest city to Amherst. She mentions Amherst one time or two maybe in her poems, but and then I wanted to understand this fact, and also what are the meaning of this many geographical references in her work, because she mentions in her poems Bolivia, Potosí, which is a city in Bolivia, Peru, Buenos Aires, Mexico twice or three times, Santo Domingo, Tenerife, Manzanilla, Belize, but she also mentions products and things from the Caribbean or the Spanish-speaking world, like the Porto and Portuguese world, like Porto wine or West Indies, or sugar or rum or bananas or the coconut cake. So I think that this is all related, but how should we understand these geographical references? Should we understand them as symbols or allegories? And then I went to the famous bibliography about this subject. Two very important texts are Rebecca Patterson, who is very well known among Dickinson scholars. She has this book, her second book on Dickinson, Emily Dickinson's Imagery, where she considers what she calls the geographic imagery as symbols. So for Rebecca Patterson, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean are, I quote, embedded in this matrix of symbols signifying incalculable wealth or unattainable desire. So she establishes a whole taxonomy and to understand the imagery as a geography in different regions, and each region has a special meaning. So for instance, Middle Eastern and Asia related to romance and luxury, Europe to fine manufacturers, and so on and so on. What is important for me, reading this book, I discovered this very important thing. The books Emily Dickinson read about Latin America. These were very famous books in the 19th century. The Prescott's History of the Conquest of Peru and Stephen's Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. Following this research, I found a very important text by Benjamin Miners, published in the Emily Dickinson Journal. And Miners, in his essay, he associates this Latin American geography with erotic desire between women, especially in his reading of her intimate letters to Susan Gilbert Dickinson. And I quote Miners: "What she knew of Latin America, she gathered in disparate ways in order to articulate her discontent and her desires beyond the nation, desires beyond the world of female romantic friendship. In her exoticization of Latin America, she both adopts the language of US imperial expansion and deploys that language to reflect on her relationship with Susan within the confines of the familiar and domestic. The Latin American spaces rendered in these poems are fantasies of exotic distance and sometimes conquest, to be sure, but they are also reimaginings of what political and erotic being might be for women living in mid to late 19th century Amherst." So these texts were in the beginning of my research, but I also wanted to understand what is geography. How can we understand geography when we are reading poems that mentions geographical locations? So I'm working with this Brazilian geographer, Milton Santos. He's very well translated in English. He was a professor at Columbia. And Milton Santos, in New Geography, Geografia Nova, he says that where classic geographers view the world as something to be delimited according to physical and cultural aspects, contemporary geographers tend to consider how space shapes material life and vice versa to form a social space. In this understanding, space is not situated in one particular place or unchangeable, but it is a process. Thus, space is permanently intertwined with time and material life. So this intertwining with material life, you see, is very important for me to read Emily Dickinson, not only as a translator of Dickinson, but as a reader of Dickinson. For instance, if we take this short poem, the 469, or the 1041 from Franklin, "Nor mountain hinder me, nor sea. Whose Baltic? Whose Cordillera?" Or I can read also, "Whose Cordillera?" with a Chilean accent. "Whose Cordillera?" Meaning is both. Then my results on this on the analyzing this poem according to a way of thinking geography is this: meaning in this poem is both determined and undetermined by geographical references, Baltic or Cordillera. This undeterminacy is created through Dickinson's odd use of a personal pronoun, who, used here for geographical entities. Through his pronoun use, Baltic and Cordillera become not symbols of something to be reunited by interpretation, but allegories for the withdrawal of meaning in a process of deferral. So I'm basically using this counterpoint that Walter Benjamin established between allegory and symbol, criticizing the romantic idea of symbol. So the allegory is something that always withdraws from a secure meaning process. Then I come back to Brazil. What is Brazil in Emily Dickinson's poems? She mentions 4 times Brazil in her works. The first time is the poem that I mentioned. I asked no other thing. The second one is very important. All scholars of Dickinson know this poem very well. It's one of the best sellers of Dickinson. My First Day Well, Since Many Will, in which he narrates a process of becoming to life after a long disease. The third poem is Some Such Butterfly Be Seen. And the fourth one is Moth, the Hue of This. So in the first one, according to this interpretation I'm doing of the poem, the merchant that appears in this poem is not God. And it's not a reference to Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. I understand that this poem is related to fabrics and to dyeing products. You may think it's strange, but this is what I call the suture. I will talk about this. In the second poem about Brazil, she says, in My First Day, Well Day Since Many You, there are these two lines. She dropped bright scraps of tint about and left Brazilian threads. Obviously, she's talking about spring, the colors of spring and the renewal of life. But why mention Brazil? Why mention Brazil? She probably mentioned Brazil because of Brazilian thread is a kind of embroidery. So she's doing a relationship of this embroidery and the colors of nature, this very specific type of embroidery. So then there are two poems that are less known, but they are very important too. The one reads like this, the first stanza: some such butterfly be seen on Brazilian pampas, just at noon, no later, sweet. Then the license closes. And then the last one, a moth the hue of this, haunt candles in Brazil. Nature's experience would make our reddest second pale. So the last two as many poems mentioning nature and South America are related to her conception of beauty. They are a reflection on aesthetic. But the two first ones are very much related with fabrics and dye products. So my question was how to move beyond the relationship with Susan in this way of considering Latin America, or the idea of an attainable desire. So this is what I call in my method of reading, stitching, and suture. So I'm taking a part of this poem here where she mentioned Brazil, and then associating this poem with another poem where she mentioned Brazil. But this way, it is a way of stitching. But this, I call it also suture because it's like suturing. When you suture something, you stitch on the alive matter. And this stitching means that your stitching is not secure. Well, suturing the four poems in Brazil, I found that they are all related somehow to garment and textile, fabric, hue, tint, dye products, etc. In Dickinson's book that she probably read in her schooling years, the Cornell's Primary Geography, this book points out that Brazil was known for its many valuable hardwood trees, such as mahogany, rosewood, dyewoods, and also for the mines of gold, silver, and diamonds. So the main thing here, I believe, is the Brazil wood, or pau-brasil, which is very important for Brazilian history and for Brazilian poetry too. This is the main red dye. This was the main red dye for luxury garments, especially for velvet, until the mid-19th century. So the history of Brazil wood is related to the history of extractivism and also related to the history of deforestation that comes until this government of Bolsonaro. So it's one long story. And I'm trying to point out that these issues were already present in Emily Dickinson's poem. If we read them not only about intimate relationship, but if we read the geographical references as the poems where we see the world interconnected by trading, by transnational relationships. So the so if we try to understand the dye products in Emily Dickinson's works, it's very interesting because we find purple, and purple is present all together in all places of Emily Dickinson's work. What is purple exactly? Well, everybody knows what's purple, including there is a political meaning of purple in the US. I'm aware of that. But for me, first of all, I have to remember that purple is extracted from murex, this shell, and it was related to power in ancient Rome. We find the word Tyrian purple and also carmine, which comes from cochineal. I'll talk about the cochineal later. If we read some of the poems of Dickinson where the purple appears, we find things like that. This short poem, purple is fashionable twice this season of the year, and when a soul perceives itself to be an emperor. And we find this another stanza that reads like this: my faith is larger than the hills. So when the hills decay, my faith must take the purple wheel to show the sun the way. So how did I found this meaning of dye products, the importance of dye products in Emily Dickinson? How did I did this teaching and this tour? I was actually analyzing a translation by Mexican translator Alberto Muller, who translated Emily Dickinson already in 1934. And I found this very interesting translation of this very well-known, this classic A Rout of Evanescence. I will not read The Rout of Evanescence because I assume that everybody knows, but I will read you the translation to Spanish. And I hope my Mexican accent can work. It reads like this: un camino desvaneciéndose al girar de una rueda, y resonancias de esmeralda y frenesís de grana. Cada capullo en la espesura alza la cabeza vencida. Tal vez llegue el correo de Túnez, cabalgata feliz de la mañana. So you have the image of the grana or the cochineal plantation. I will talk about it soon. And you have also some image of how the Phoenicians would deal with the murex or the purple. So I have to move it here. So Owen's, I'm not seeing, let's see that. Always rendering of the poem involves another complex subject, making geography and transnational economies meet in translation. Then I follow my reading like this. On the one hand, this offers a beautiful rhyme with which to end the poem, grana and mañana. On the other, he is reintegrating cochineal into its native country. Cochineal is best known in Mexico as grana cochinilla, or simply grana. This dye stuff produced from an insect that grows on the nopal cactus, los nopales, has a long tradition in Mexican culture and was very important product in the transnational economy of colonial times, much like Brazil would. Following this argument, I understand Tunis not only as a reference to the capital city of North African Tunisia, or to William Shakespeare's The Tempest, or as a mere Orientalist exoticism, but also as the purple color produced by the murex shell, an important product in Mediterranean history and the textile economy throughout the centuries. Both this poem and Owen's translations belong to Dickinson's imaginary geography, in the sense that they intertwine the aesthetic with the international trade in the 19th century, in the same way that she interweaves metaphysics and everyday life. So I'm basically trying to show that it's not pure exoticism. That we should read these geographical references as part of the international trade in the 19th century. So this can lead us to understand how much Emily Dickinson was not secluded at all, that the world was inside her mind, and she was very thoughtful about what was happening everywhere. Obviously, there are exoticism and there are friendship, there are affective relationships between she and Susan. But we should also consider that the presence of American imperialism inside her poems is part of the poem. It's not that something that is outside the poem. This is basically my arguments on the theoretical part of my essay. In the second part of my essay, the same essay to the Oxford book, I analyzed different translators of Emily Dickinson. There are tons of translators of Emily Dickinson in the Spanish and Portuguese world. Actually, in Brazil, everybody is a translator of Emily Dickinson. It's very funny when I say, oh, I come here to talk about Emily Dickinson because I translate her. And everybody says, I translate Emily Dickinson too. So everybody translates Emily Dickinson. All important poets of Brazilian modernism have translated one or more poems of Emily Dickinson. And this happens also in the Spanish world and Latin American Spanish world. She's very present. So I had to make a cut to understand who are the translators of Dickinson. So I have chosen these translators because they are all important poets for modern poetry in the Spanish and Portuguese world, and even for the contemporary poetry. So, excuse me. Are you following me okay? Okay, let's go. The first one is Juan Ramon Jimenez, Nobel Prize in 17. The second one was Brazilian Manuel Bandeira. I hope to talk about him in Sevilla next year. By the way, I hope to see you all alive in Sevilla in 2022. Not alive, personally. I'm sorry. So Manuel Bandeira, and I'll talk about him today. It's very important, this relationship of Bandeira and Emily. And then Gilberto Owen, I have already talked about him, the Mexican translator and writer, very great writer. Then Silvina Ocampo, the Argentinian writer, friend to Jorge Luis Borges and Bioy Casares. Portuguese poet and intellectual Jorge de Cena, one of the most important intellectuals in Portuguese culture in the 20th century. He dedicated one book only of translations of Dickinson. Then Augusto de Campos, he's a contemporary poet, but he was very important in Brazilian avant-garde. And I will not talk about him because you can find Augusto de Campos in the newest Emily Dickinson bulletin that is just appearing. So there is an interview with Augusto de Campos. If you are members of the society, you can read this interview. And then there's Ana Cristina Cesar, a Brazilian poet of the 80s, 70s, and 80s. She died very young, and she's a great, a very popular poet right now among Brazilian young readers. And she was translating Emily Dickinson, and we have a bunch of poems translated by her. And Ana Luisa Amaral, the Portuguese poet. I will talk later about Ana Luisa Amaral too. So all of them are important for me to understand how Emily Dickinson was translated in the Spanish and Portuguese world. So during the process of my work, I worked with this idea of reverse translation. The idea of reverse translation, I brought it from the medical studies, from the oncology studies. The idea that in my case, I don't want to present the translations of Dickinson to English language readers. I have to show why these poets translated Dickinson, how close they were to Dickinson. So I translate their own poems into English so the reader can better understand why did they choose to translate Dickinson. So I will read the Manuel Bandeira poem, for instance, Supper. This is from Manuel Bandeira, the second translator of Emily Dickinson. When the undesired one comes, maybe tough, maybe tender, I might be afraid. Or maybe I'll smile and say, hello, undelusional. I had a good day, the night may fall, night and its witchcraft. It will find the lamp tilled, the house clean, the table set, with everything in its place. And then we find Manuel Bandeira translation of My Life Closed Twice. Já morri duas vezes e vivo, resta-me ver enfim, se terceira vez na vida sofrerei assim. Dor tão funda e desesperada, o pungir cotidiano e eterno, só sabemos do céu o que é a Deus. Basta a saudade como inferno. And then to close, I have to talk a few words about, I'm having trouble here, okay. About gender and translation. One of the translators that I studied in my essay is Ana Luisa Amaral, a Portuguese contemporary writer, poet, and intellectual. She just won the literary prize, Premio Reina Sofia, which is a prize for, it's like the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. And it's interesting because it's a prize for both Portuguese and Spanish writers from Latin America, Portugal and Spain, and so on. And she was just rewarded this week. This very important, it's a very important fact for us. So her translation, she's very well known also in Portugal she's one of the main representatives of the gender studies in Portugal. She published several books about gender studies, about feminism, about lesbian issues, and so on. And her translation of Volcanoes Be in Sicily is very important because this is a key poem to understand Dickens, the Emily Dickinson queer writings. And you probably know the famous essay by Adrienne Rich about this poem. So this is a key poem. And the way Ana Luisa Amaral translated it, it's sublime. It's a gem in Portuguese language. So her translation of these poems also underlines the gender issues and the sexuality issues present in this poem. And this is why it's very important. So I'm just going to read here. I don't have time to analyze it fully, but I have to read it here so that you can feel the musicality, the beautiful musicality of this translation. Os vulcões são na Sicília e na América do Sul. Diz-me a minha geografia. Mas há vulcões mesmo aqui. Se quiser, posso escalar. Passo de lava após passo, contemplar cratera eu posso. O Vesúvio é cá em casa. I think this last line is one of the most beautiful lines that I read in Portuguese language too. O Vesúvio é cá em casa. Vesuvius at home. I wish I could talk more about this translation, but the time is running and I'm about to finish. I just have to mention a few important works. It is an ending. The importance of Emily Dickinson in Spanish and Portuguese language is amazing. It's a never-ending story. For instance, Maria Gabriela Liansol, Portuguese writer and poet, very important. She translated Emily Dickinson's writings. Argentinian writer Paola Kaufman, who died at very young, but she has a novel translated in English called The Sister. It's the life of Dickinson narrated by Lavinia, and Daniela Libertad, and Herman Bravo Varela, Mexican poets, and our colleagues from Barcelona, Ana Maria Mendes and Maria Milagros Rivera Garretas, who translated the complete poems in 3 volumes in a very gendered perspective, which is very, very interesting. I used a lot her translations, and they are a model for my own translation too. And then there's Maria Negroni, a very outstanding intellectual in Argentina, Brazilian poet Pauline Hickey Brito, is one of the most important poems in Brazil. He is also a kind of Dickinson scholar here in Brazil, although I want to invite him sometime to give a lecture at the Dickinson Society, because I think he's the most important poet right now in Brazil, and he has wrote a lot of essays on Emily Dickinson's verse. And then there is Juan Carlos Carovillo, I think he's probably here, the Mexican professor and colleague of the Dickinson Society, and he just published this book, Emily Dickinson, Las Ruedas de las Aves, with translations of the manuscripts, the envelope poems. And this just appeared in Mexico. And I think this proves that Emily Dickinson's work is spreading, continues to blossom in the Spanish and Portuguese world. And just to finish, I want to read the work I'm doing right now. Is translating Dickinson to Brazilian Amerindian languages, because I feel like she will sound good in this almost 200 native languages we have in Brazil. And this is the language of my ancestors, the Guarani. And I will read you to finish my talk, this version I did of this famous poem, I Am Nobody. She avave, mava piconde, de avave avei, u peixero nyande mokoi. Anire mombeku, nyane mosine. Cane o nyane mo avaro, mbonye motu, petei juisha. Je ej hera, o paara, tu jurenendu. That's it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Adalberto. You could just, that was amazing. That was wonderful. Blown away, particularly by the last one that you just did. So we have plenty of time for questions. If you want to ask a question, I ask you to use the little raise your hand function, because what that does is it lines up the questions along the top. So waving isn't as helpful as using that little icon. But you can also wave if you can't figure out the icon. I just wanted to ask you about that last one that you did. I'll start it off, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. I love the way you performed it. And I'm just wondering, Adalberto, like, did it have to be performed like that? Because it was really like, in other words, is that kind of performative and explosive quality that you brought to your reading, is that intrinsic to the language itself? Or did you choose to like, kind of like, you know, flare it up, you know, for various reasons? And it kind of opens, that's like an example just like of a larger question, which is, what is your sense about how Dickinson sounds, you know, in other languages, and how does the sound change? You know,
Oh, this is a very important question for me, Marion. This is also related why I've chosen Chris Müller edition of her poems to translate, because I am very much attached with the idea that Emily Dickinson's poems can be read and interpreted in oral way. They are not only visual poems. I also agree with the works of Martha Werner and Martin L. Smith. It is very important to see, because she's very modern, to see the visuality of the poem. But for me, every translation I did from the 800,000, what? 1800 poets, I would read it before publish. Reading or transforming or searching for the orality of the poem, or the performance of the poem, is very important for me. For me, it must sound somehow. And in Guarani language, the Guarani culture, as other Brazilian indigenous culture, they are non-written cultures. They are non-written cultures, so they don't write. So the performance of a poem is very important in Guarani. So if I translate Emily Dickinson to Guarani, I have to imagine a kind of ritual performance. I have to become the Indian, the Guarani myself, in order to read it. And Emily Dickinson comes with me. I have to ask her, oh, let's go and let's perform in among our friends the Avanye, and you have to perform your poem. That's what I do.
awesome. Thank you. Antoine?
Yes, hello everyone. Hello Adalberto, good to see you. And thank you for this wonderful talk, and it's just fascinating, and your performances are just amazing. I have a general remark and then a question. So my general remark is about what you said about trade, and how the world of international commerce and trade was already present in Dickinson's poems. And this made me think very much, of course, of translation itself as being a kind of trade and commerce. And even more, I'm sure you're familiar with these theories about translation being a form of smuggling, that is an illicit kind of trade that you introduce into another language, of course, officially, but also unofficially. You make a writer part of another culture, and then being smuggled into that country, the translated writer can perform a kind of subversive role within the foreign culture, bringing her own, her own imagination, her own world into that culture and transform that culture from the inside. So that's just a general remark to remind us that amongst the many metaphors for translation, one is smuggling, and I love that one. My question has to do with another American poet who has a very strong connection with Brazil, and it's Elizabeth Bishop, of course. So just wondering if, and Bishop being a kind of, United States writer, but also who spent her childhood in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and then spent much of her adulthood in Brazil. So I was wondering, how did you ever use a poetry or the dialogue she has with the Brazilian culture to, did you factor that in your research on Dickinson and the ways in which she speaks about Brazil? I'm thinking of the wonderful poem Arrival at Santos, for instance, but also our entire collection, Geography 3, which is all about the powerful imagination that geography has, the powerful hold that geography has over our imagination, I must say. So I would just, another woman poet, American who had a love affair, literally, with Brazil. So I just would like to hear you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoine, for this. There are two questions are very important for me. The first one relates to the relationship of trading and translation. And at the same time, I could expand this to diplomacy and translation, but also to smuggling and translation. It's an anecdote. It's very anecdotic. But I was born in the border of Brazil and Paraguay, in a place which is a border without river. So it's a place of smuggling all the time. So the idea of it's 3 languages spoken. There are 3 languages spoken in this border of Brazil: Spanish, Portuguese, and Guarani. So the idea of smuggling and translating is part of my everyday life. But then I went to study diplomacy too. Before studying languages, I studied diplomacy. So I think that translation is the diplomacy and smuggling and trading always coexisted with translation. This is the first issue. The second one is related to this because the presence of the trading products in Emily Dickinson is obviously, this is what I'm trying to show, is obviously related to the presence of the US trading in the world. So as much as Herman Melville, who is for me, the real contemporary of Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, the world is inside Herman Melville works because US trading was already controlling the trading overall. So it's a natural fact to understand that the world is inside Emily Dickinson's works. And the last question about Elizabeth Schipper, I think this idea very brilliant. I don't know if there are many works about that, but well, you know that they were very different. They had a very different characters, although there are some similarities in the way that both of them treat the geographical references or the cultural references, because they don't use it as a mere babble. It's not something to embellish the poem. And what I'm trying to say that if Emily Dickinson, when she uses Brazil, she goes deep inside of it. It's not just a mere mention of it, but it's very important. It's as important as to understand any other word of the poem. So you have to interpret the geographical references too, as much as you have to interpret the biblical references or the Shakespeare references. And once you read Dickinson in this way, you understand that she was aware of the way American trading and American empire was expanding towards the US. Well, Bishop, on the other hand, she lived in Brazil. She experienced Brazil. And but I cannot say that she continues, she remains for us, even her Brazilian poems remain strangely foreign to us, Brazilian, you know? It will be always a foreign side of Brazil. And you can read Bishop and Emily Dickinson, although one lived in Brazil, the other not, you can read it in the same way, both of the poets.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos Calvillo.
Thank you very much. Adalberto, thank you so much for this talk. I had a question. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on Emily Dickinson's influence on the Campos brothers and concretismo. Would you say Emily's transgression of traditional form, the visual quality of the poem you were just mentioning a while ago, may have had an early impact on the ideological development of concrete poetry and or conceptual art? I guess this is a difficult question, but
no, not at all. It's interesting because I cannot only agree with you, but I can prove it.
Oh, great!
Not only because the Campus brothers they were already mentioning Emily Dickinson in the 60s, and they were very related to some poets that mentioned Dickinson, like E. Cummings, or more especially William Carlos Williams, and also because before the Campos brothers, another very, very important Brazilian poet of the 50s called Mário Faustino, he referred Emily Dickinson as one of the poets of the Paideuma. This word from Ezra Pound, and he was already Mário Faustino lived in the U.S. in the 50s. I think that he probably have had access to the Johnsons. When is the Johnsons? When does the Johnsons edition come? In 55 only. Yeah, and he probably read the Johnson's edition, and he published very early, before the Concretistas, he published about Emily Dickinson. So I'm sure that Emily Dickinson was very influential on the what Augusto de Campos calls the visuality of the form of Emily Dickinson's poem, and he stresses that very much in his translations, as you will see in my analysis of his own translations of Dickinson. So yes, I totally agree with you. She's very important for the concretismo in Brazil.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Cynthia?
Hello, I just wanted to thank you so much. This has been fascinating in so many different ways. And I'm just personally learning Spanish myself, so it's extra beautiful and extra meaningful to me. So thank you so much. My question is, do you have an opinion on, with her reading the books that you shared with us, do you think she could have had a very simple, basic understanding of some Spanish words? And I ask because I'm interested in Emily Dickinson and letters of the alphabet. And there are some very evocative Spanish words, like the word for and, which is a Y and pronounced E. So I'm just wondering, do you think she could have been somewhat familiar with the Spanish language?
That's a good question, because I wonder how she would spell the names like Pizarro.
Mm-hmm.
Pizarro, no? She used many words from the Latin American word, and I think that if you read the Prescott's book on the conquest of Peru, it's in Prescott, you will find the original words, and sometimes she misspells some words, like when she refers to the famous volcano in Puebla. What's the name, Juan Carlos? Popo. What's
I know it's
I was there, but I can never pronounce it. And she misspells this. This word. Or the Chimborazo. There is a very important point when she talks about her relationship with Susan, and she compares love to the Chimborazo. And I wonder how Emily Dickinson herself would spell Chimborazo.
No, that's very interesting. And I will read that book that you recommended. And it seems like sometimes she misspelled English too. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Another source that you might consider, Adalberto, is Washington Irving's Life of Columbus, which she read. We know she read that. So there might be some stuff in there too. Do you have, I think we have time for one more question. Do we have one more?
I have one more question if we have time.
We do.
I was just wondering if you had thought about, you know, you gave us a lot of really interesting examples about dyeing in different colors and different dye stuffs. And I was wondering if you had thought about that in terms of a pun on dying, in terms of being dead, losing your life. You know, the two different meanings of dying, to change color and to lose your life.
Oh, this is a very important question, because this is there's an important editorial decision on the word die, you know, in Emily Dickinson. I think it's doom is the house without the door, or yes, doom is the house without the door. And there is a different transcription of Johnson transcript is as die, dying, the verb, but there is a different transcription in Christina Müller's edition. I think that the right transcription was made by Franklin first. So it's not, if you read the poem, reads like this, the first line: the doom is the house without the door. And in Christina Müller's transcription, you read die of the dying products. The bear is die, and in Johnson's you read die as the verb dying. So this is, I think that this is a very important question. It's related. We can relate the idea of fabrics to death, or the lady's drawer in another poem, a very famous poem. And there's always this idea, this relationship between fabrics, dyeing products, and death in her poems.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, we do need to end this talk. I do see that there are a couple of hands raised. We can. I'm happy to leave the Zoom open indefinitely. People can chat. I'll have to step away in a minute or two, but this can just stay open as much as people want to. So I just want to thank you, Adalberto. That was really just like so great. I feel like my whole world has kind of been opened, you know, like my soul, just like my way of relating, and to the world and to Emily Dickinson. So really, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to whoever developed Zoom for creating such a great opportunity for us. So great, wonderful. And again, it'll stay open if people want to chat, either with Adalberto or me or anything like that. Okay, so thank you all so much. And that draws it to an end.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, you're most welcome. It's great.
So there was another hand raised. Is there another question? I still have a few minutes.
Cynthia Hallen was there and she had a question, but I think she just left.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you feel like what gets lost in translation to Portuguese? Actually, but maybe other people want to ask questions. I shouldn't have like put it in there, but you know, like I just think of her as this kind of like sober New England, you know, kind of like sing-songy poet. You know, if you have thoughts about that, I'd love to hear. But I also, other people should butt it.
Everything is lost in translation. Everything, always, always.
Yeah.
Any word is translatable, and meanwhile, translation is necessary.
Yeah, no question. That's right. But I'm just curious, like, what is it? Is it the religiosity? Is it the, you know, the kind of the Spartanness of her, you know,
Yeah, it's very, what is more difficult, always what's all more difficult to me was translating the difference of the iambic meter into Portuguese. This is the most difficult thing. The matters of prosody for me, this is where that I really cannot translate, because I have to adapt it to my own language.
Yeah.
Can I just say something about this?
There was someone that.
Or maybe someone else. Yeah.
Go ahead, Antoine. That's right.
I was just going to say, it so happens that I spent 5 hours this afternoon with students translating Dickinson in a workshop. So we worked on 2 poems, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, and the other was Must Be a Woe, a Loss of So. Yeah. And I just want to say that what is lost in translation, one of the most difficult things to do in French is to find enough short words, monosyllables, to translate the very terse, sparse lines of Dickinson. And if you do that, the problem is that very often you can't do it. But when you can actually do it, then the poems sound a little bit off key because they are too, I don't know, too abstract maybe, or too Mallarméan. They sound like Mallarmé. And Dickinson doesn't sound like Mallarmé because there's a lot of movement and, different speeds in Dickinson. There's a lot of agentivity. It's not just concepts and words that are sparsely put on the page, but it's much more the relationship between small words, not worlds, big words and small words. And that, I mean, you can do it in French. Maybe it's the same in Spanish and Portuguese, but that's definitely in French. We love our big words.
The monosyllabic words in English, they are our hell. They are our hell. We don't have it. We have a very few monosyllabic words. Emily Dickinson stresses the monosyllabic word. I believe that the best translation of Dickinson is the Russian one. The Russian is perfect. It's just perfect to Emily Dickinson. I have a couple of translations of her into Russian because the Russian doesn't need articles. The articles. So you have this only the words without articles. And it's very Dickinsonian.
Not a question, but I do want to thank you. And I do want to thank you especially for using the word lens just now, because whatever's lost in translation, you've presented us with a wonderful lens for seeing a world and telling us that Dickinson was not bad at seeing a world through that lens herself. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're welcome very much.
Alberto, I didn't say your name correctly. I'm Ellie.
Yeah, it's Adalberto, yes.
I wanted to just talk to you and Antoine about the difficulty with those 2 languages are all the vowels at the ends of the words. So you have an accent problem as well as a sense and, syllable. You have a syllable problem, actually. But years ago, there was a funniest thing going on when we were all first on email. There was a lot of back translation happening, and the results were really funny. So my question is, when you assign your students to do this back translation, is it sometimes so off that it's comical? Or, I mean, I'm sure you're not cruel, but to what extent, does it do funny things happen in this back translation process? Either of you, both of you.
One?
Well, I rarely practice back translation with my students. But I think you're right, Ellie, about the endings of the words with all the vowels. I was just telling my students this afternoon that if you want to rhyme the poems in the translation, one of the issues in French is masculine and feminine rhymes. So rhymes ending with a vowel, and that's not the main issue with Dickinson's rhyming. So if you try to rhyme the poems in the translation in French, you get it wrong in one way or another. So there's no way of, there are ways, but it's very difficult to do. Back translation, no, I haven't tried that very much. Excuse me, I have a bad cough, but it can be, I can see how it can be comical. Like, and translation is a form of distortion anyway. So if you distort the distortion by back translating, it becomes very quickly like a caricature of a poem.
Yeah, I agree with Antoine.
Because words that are metaphoric in our understanding, students read as literal. So you do get some pretty funny results sometimes.
I use a lot, now I'm using a lot of digital tools in translation, like when you use Depot, for instance, and sometimes you see where the machine, the limits of the machine. And when you put Dickinson's lines or sentences in the digital tool, the digital translator, you see that that's poetry. That's where no machine can translate it. But I believe that there are very good translations of Dickinson in different languages, and even in Spanish and Portuguese. And I'm not afraid of saying that some of the translations are better. You think that this is horrible to say, but no, there are very, very good translations of Dickinson. And sometimes, I remember when I was translating Dickinson, Andrea Simon, you know the writer, Andrea Simon, a writer from New York. And Andrea told me, why are you translating all of the Dickinson poems? But because you know, many of them are not that good.
Many of the poems, you mean the original Dickinson's poem?
Yeah, and that's true. That's true. Not everything from Dickinson is magnificent.
That's right.
So
thank you. It was a wonderful, you were very generous to do this for us today, as Antoine was the last time. I'm going to say goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
And good to see everybody else.
Good to see you.
Helen, hi.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, you can be very creative in translation. For instance, one of our students, and this is a student in translation, so we were working this afternoon on the poem Must Be a Woe, a Loss or So, to Bend the Eye Best Beauty's Way. And the last stanza in this poem, so these are very short lines, very short lines, 2 iambs per line. And the last stanza reads like this: Our Lord thought no extravagance to pay across. And so the student had a very good idea. What she did is she split the word extravagant, which is the same in French, on 2 lines, so that the lines are shorter. And so her stanza reads: Jésus ne le trouva extravagant une croix.
That's terrific. That's great.
That was just fantastic, because it's exactly, it goes in the direction of Dickinson's creativity, playing with the plasticity of words. And she really integrated the constraints of the short lines to the point that she transformed the words. I just found that fantastic.
And there's another point on this very translation. My translation reads, it rhymes Cruz and Jesus. And it's better because the Portuguese language has this, you have this natural rhyme between Cruz and Jesus. The words rhyme. And the most important words in the Catholic liturgy rhyme in Portuguese: Cruz and Jesus. So the translation is already done. You know? So,
that's great. I love it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear you defending translations of poems, because in George Steiner, he talks about the limitations of translation, but he says we're translating each other even when we speak in the same language. You are translating me right now. And he said, a good translation is a balance of what's gained in the new language and what's lost in the previous language. And so a good translation balances the losses and the gains. And when you have a good translation, you're going to learn something. You're going to have a poem in that language that makes that poem live again. I mean, it's a resurrection. Translation is a resurrection of the poem, a good translation. And also Alton Becker, in his book, Beyond Translation, talks about the same principle. There's always exuberances and deficiencies when we are trying to interpret a message from anyone. And what we try to do is balance those, acknowledge those exuberances. But I think you're right. Sometimes the translation of Emily Dickinson poem, for example, in Swedish, is just a progression of the original poem that Dickinson intended.
Mhm. Well, I just wrote a piece saying that actually in the foreword of my second volume of Dickinson, I have this idea that the translator is also is really he functions like a balance wheel. In this sense that he is responsible for the balance. It's because of the translation that you can find balance. The translator is this wheel of the balance, and this is why I think that a real translator must have a very good skills and a very good mood to translate in order to find this balance, which is the most delicate work, because many translators want to recreate the poem. Other translators want to just say, this is not translatable, let's just create a version of it and point out to the original. And I think that both attitudes are excessive, because from one side, if you recreate totally the poem, you are no longer reading this author. You're reading just another author. On the other hand, if it's a servile translation, it's an ancillary translation, what we call, this translation doesn't help you very much, because there are words that have 2 or 3 or 4 different meanings, and there is no it's not possible to be faithful, because words mean there are layers in words. So both translations are useless from my perspective. So I think that the real work of the translator is to becoming that wheel, this balance wheel somehow in a process. This is how I see it. Okay, fair enough. I think we can wrap it. I'm really glad to see you, and I hope to see you in the next Dickinson Live, or at least in the next annual meeting of Emily Dickinson at Shakespeare House in Stratford-upon-Avon. And everyone is invited who is not already inscribed is invited. And I think I just want to say thank you again. Thank you all for being here and to stay with me. Stay tuned.
Thank you, Adalberto. Fantastic. Bravo.
Bravo, Alberto.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Adios.
See you soon.
Até logo.
Adios.
Marianne, are you still there?